In the hill country of Middle Tennessee, there's a piece of land that changed owners 4 separate times between 1884 and 1903. And every single deed filed at the Rutherford County Courthouse came with the same strange addition. A handwritten clause, copied word for word from one sale to the next, as if the person writing it was terrified to change even a single syllable. It said, "The cabin at the eastern edge of the property is to remain secured. No inquiry shall be made of its contents. No entry is to be attempted." 4 different owners, 4 different lawyers, and not one of them ever asked why. For 19 years, that cabin sat with its door bolted from the outside, its only window covered with planks so thick they had to have been cut just for that purpose. The neighbors all knew it was there. The kids playing in the fields near by knew it was there. And every single one of them had been taught from the time they were old enough to listen that some things are better left alone. Then, in the autumn of 1903, a family came down from Cincinnati who hadn't learned that lesson. They had no history with that land, no memory of what the county had quietly and together agreed to forget. And when they asked about the cabin, in that easy, cheerful way of people who have no reason to be afraid, the silence that met them was so complete, so instant, and so shared that even they felt it. But they opened it anyway. What they found inside wouldn't be understood for another 10 years. And when it finally was understood, several people who had lived in that county their whole lives refused to speak of it ever again. Before we go any further into the story of the Harrow property and what was hidden inside that locked cabin for 19 years, if you're new to this channel, welcome. We tell stories here that history tried to bury. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming, and drop a comment letting us know what state or city you're listening from. We really want to know where our audience is. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what was in that cabin, you have to understand what happened on that land long before the door was ever bolted shut. That property was known from at least the 1830s as the Totem Place. A man named Elias Totem cleared the land himself, working alongside 8 enslaved people he brought from Georgia when he moved his family to Tennessee's Central Basin in 1831. He wasn't wealthy by the standards of his time and place, not a big planter, no columned house or hundreds of acres. But he was comfortable enough to own other human beings, and comfortable enough to keep them. The Totem land sat on about 240 acres of mixed woods and bottomland near the Stones River, where the soil was dark and rich, and the summers were long enough to grow tobacco and corn in amounts that kept the family fed and the debt book mostly in the black. Rutherford County itself was already well established when Elias arrived. Murfreesboro had been incorporated back in 1817 and had all the signs of a place that considered itself permanent. A courthouse, a post road, several churches of different kinds, and the kind of social setup that comes from a community deciding together what matters and what doesn't. What Rutherford County valued in 1831 was order. What it didn't value, or rather what it had learned to carefully ignore, was the machinery needed to keep that order in place. Elias Totem's 8 enslaved workers lived in 3 cabins behind the main house, separated by a kitchen garden and a woodpile. The easternmost cabin, the one farthest from the house and closest to the tree line, was the smallest. It had been built, according to county records, in 1833, 2 years after the others, and it was built differently. Thicker walls, a smaller window set up high, and unlike the other cabins, its door hinges were mounted on the outside so that when it was locked from the outside. None of this was unusual enough in 1833 to raise any eyebrows. Elias Totem died in 1849, leaving the property to his oldest son, Cornelius, who was 27 and had grown up on that land. Cornelius inherited not just the property and its debts, but also the 7 enslaved people still living there. One had died in the years between. and whatever understanding he had developed as a child about how that land worked, he had watched his father, he knew the routines. He stepped into running the place like a man who had been rehearsing that role his whole life without really realizing it. By 1855, Cornelius was working the property with 9 enslaved people, having picked up 2 more from a neighbor settling debts. He had also married a woman named Dorinda Pewitt, the daughter of a preacher from Smyrna, who brought a deep and genuine religious faith and a habit of keeping journals. It's Dorinda's journals, 3 of them found in a trunk at the Murfreesboro Public Library in 1914, that give us the clearest picture of life on the Totham property in the years before the war. She wrote about her garden. She wrote about her 3 children born between 1856 and 1861. She wrote about the weather with the kind of detail only someone who knows that weather runs everything in a farming household would use. The planting, the harvest, travel, the health of people and animals alike, and every so often, tucked between entries about scripture and running a household, she wrote about the Eastern cabin. Not often, not with any obvious alarm, but she wrote about it. The first mention comes in March of 1857. Cornelius has moved Amos to the East cabin alone. He says it's necessary for managing the others. I didn't ask any more. The second mention is from July that same year. The East cabin is kept locked at night now. Cornelius carries the key himself. I haven't seen Amos at the communal meals for weeks. Eliza brings food to the door. Then nothing for almost 2 years. The third mention is from January of 1859, and it's different. Dorinda's handwriting, usually so neat and steady, gets shaky here. The letters pressing harder into the page like she's fighting something as she writes. She doesn't explain what she saw. She doesn't describe what she found when she apparently walked to the Eastern cabin on her own one morning, while Cornelius was away at the market in Murfreesboro. She writes only, I understand now why the window is where it is. I understand now what the lock is for. God forgive this house. And then she doesn't bring it up again for another 18 months. Reading Dorinda Totham's journals in order, you feel the particular kind of horror that comes from a woman who has made a choice about what she will and won't let herself know. She wasn't ignorant. She was educated, literate, clearly capable of deep moral thinking, but she had married into a system and lived inside it. And the cost of truly seeing that system was one she decided she couldn't pay. So she looked away and the East cabin stayed locked. And Amos, whoever he had been before March of 1857, disappeared entirely from the written record of the Totham household. Then the Civil War came to Rutherford County with a force that caught even those who expected it off guard. The Battle of Stones River, fought at the very end of December 1862 into the first days of January 1863, was one of the bloodiest battles of the whole war. Nearly 13,000 Union casualties, more than 10,000 Confederate, all on ground that Rutherford County families had farmed and walked and been buried on for decades. The sound of that battle could be heard for miles. The wounded were brought into Murfreesboro in numbers that overwhelmed every building they had. Churches, the courthouse, private homes. Cornelius Totham wasn't a soldier. He was 39 in 1862, and whatever exemptions or arrangements he'd made to avoid being drafted, he stayed on his property when the armies came through. He had sent Dorinda and the kids to her father's house in Smyrna at the first sign of Union troop movements, and he stayed behind to protect, as he put it in a letter, what is mine. What happened on the Totham property during those weeks in December and January comes from 3 sources. A deposition from a Union soldier named Corporal Frederick Osterhaus, who passed through the area in early January 1863. A letter Cornelius wrote to his wife on January 9th that year, and an account recorded by a freedman named Solomon Gentry in 1871 as part of a labor dispute in Nashville. Corporal Osterhaus noted in his deposition that his unit camped briefly on or near the Totem property on the night of January 4th. He wrote that they saw a small cabin at the eastern edge of the farm, heavily built with a bolted door, and they heard from inside a sound he described as a voice, but not speaking in any way he could make out, more like something between a man singing to himself and a man talking to himself, who's been doing it so long he's forgotten there's a difference. He wrote that they didn't open the cabin, they had orders to keep moving. Cornelius's letter to Dorinda, written 5 days later, doesn't mention Union soldiers at all. It's almost entirely about the condition of the livestock and the outbuildings after what he calls the disturbances of last week. Near the end of the letter, almost like an afterthought, he writes, "The situation with Amos has resolved itself. There's no need to discuss it further when you return." Solomon Gentry's account, recorded 8 years later in the middle of a labor dispute that had nothing directly to do with the Totem property, has one passage that seems to refer to these events. Gentry had worked on a neighboring farm before and after the war, and had known some of the people from the Totem place. He said that in the first week of January 1863, a man came out of the woods on the eastern side of the Totem property and walked through 3 fields before anyone saw him. He couldn't say his own name when they asked. He had been in that place, the small one with the thick walls, since before the cold came. God help us, nobody counted how long. When they asked him questions, he answered, but the answers didn't fit the questions. Like a man who's been keeping time in a way that doesn't match the clock everyone else is using. Gentry doesn't name this man. He doesn't say what happened to him after. The account just moves on to other things, and that passage sits there in the middle of a labor document like something that wandered in from a different story. It's the only surviving first-hand account that might, if you read it carefully enough, describe Amos walking out of the east cabin during the chaos of the battle's aftermath. Or it might describe someone else entirely. The documents don't answer that. They only raise the question and then go silent, the way records from that era often do when they brush up against something people had decided together not to write down. Cornelius Totem survived the war, but his property didn't fare as well. The tobacco fields were mostly torn up, fences were down across most of the acreage, and the labor arrangements that had kept the farm running were gone with emancipation. Several of the people who had been enslaved on the Totem place left immediately. A few stayed for wages that Cornelius couldn't always pay. Dorinda came back from Smyrna in the spring of 1863 with the children and started writing in her journals again. She wrote about how hard Reconstruction was with the same careful attention she gave everything. The practical challenges that changed social landscape, the bewildering new arrangements of a world that had been, as she put it, turned on its face and set back down, and nothing is where it was before. She doesn't mention Amos again, and she doesn't mention the East cabin again by name. But in an entry from September 1863, she writes something that scholars have always had trouble explaining. Cornelius has started using the East cabin for storage, tobacco tools mostly. He changed the door hardware last month. I don't know why I find this significant. Maybe because I've spent 6 years not looking at that door, and now every time I cross the yard I look at it without meaning to. So the East cabin became a storage shed. The property limped through Reconstruction, losing acreage to debts, selling pieces to neighbors, and eventually to a land company that was buying up farmland in the area. By 1875, the Totems held only about 60 of the original 240 acres. Cornelius died in 1877 from a lung condition that had been getting worse for years. Dorinda sold the remaining property the next year and moved to Murfreesboro to live with her oldest daughter. The property went to a man named Warren Gillespie, who had come from Virginia after the war and built a small business trading in farm equipment and seed. He wasn't a farmer himself. He leased the fields to tenant families and kept the main house mostly as a residence. He was the first owner of the property who had no living memory of the Totham household, and therefore no particular reason to pay any attention to the east cabin. But he still didn't open it, and that's the detail that gets harder to explain the further you get from the war. Gillespie didn't open the east cabin, and the family that bought the property from Gillespie's estate in 1889, a couple named Holt from North Carolina, didn't open it either. Both deeds had that handwritten addendum: the cabin is to remain secured, no inquiry is to be made. Where did that language come from? Gillespie would have had to ask someone local when he bought the place. A lawyer, a neighbor, someone familiar with the county and its ways. Someone told him about the clause. Someone explained, however vaguely, why it existed, and he accepted it. He didn't push, he didn't ask. That tells you something. Not that people kept the cabin locked, that makes sense in all kinds of ways. But that each new owner accepted the clause without any apparent resistance or documented curiosity. It suggests the explanation they were given was enough, that whoever told them about the cabin told them enough to make them understand that opening it wasn't worth whatever they might find. What were they told? The documents alone can't answer that, but that's the question the new family from Cincinnati in October 1903 didn't know to ask. Their name was Petton. Arthur Petton was 34, a bookkeeper who had decided, with the kind of optimism that comes from spending your adult life behind a ledger and starting to feel the walls close in, that he wanted to try farming. His wife Catherine was 31 and had grown up on a farm in Indiana and had mixed feelings about going back to one, which she mostly kept to herself. They had 2 children, a boy named Edmund who was 9 and a girl named Vera who was 6. They had bought the property mostly unseen through a land agent in Nashville, who described it as a fine Middle Tennessee farm with solid improvements and excellent soil. The price was good, and Arthur took that as a sign of opportunity rather than, as maybe he should have, a reason to be curious. They arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the leaves on the surrounding hills were at their peak color, and the air had that special quality of a Tennessee autumn. Cool in the mornings, warm by afternoon, the light coming in at an angle that makes everything look like it's being watched rather than just existing. Catherine stood in the farmyard and looked at the house and the outbuildings and the fields and said it was beautiful. Arthur agreed. Edmund immediately ran toward the tree line to see what was there. It was Edmund who found the east cabin first. He came back to where his parents were unloading the wagon and reported that there was a little building at the edge of the yard back toward the trees with boards over its window and a very big, very old-looking lock on the door. Arthur walked over to look. He examined the lock, which was indeed old, a heavy iron padlock of a design that hadn't been made in at least 30 years. He looked at the door and the boards over the window. He walked around the structure once, noticing how thick the walls were and how well it was built. Then he went back to unloading the wagon. That evening, after the kids were in bed, he mentioned it to Catherine. She asked if the land agent had said anything about a storage cabin on the east side. Arthur said he didn't think it had come up. She said someone must have the key then, or they'd have to cut the lock. Arthur agreed and said he'd ask around in town the next week. He asked around the next week. The response he got wasn't hostile or dramatic. It was actually quite polite. The hardware store owner said he wasn't sure who might have the key. The postmaster said he didn't know much about the property's history. 2 neighbors he ran into on the street said they weren't familiar with the outbuildings over there. A woman at the dry goods counter said pleasantly that some things on old properties are best left to settle themselves. Arthur Petton was from Cincinnati. He had been raised in a city where the past was something that happened elsewhere, in other people's families, in other places. He wasn't tuned into the particular frequency of a community that has made a collective decision to not know something. He heard the vagueness in what people said and figured it was just the natural reserve of rural Tennesseans toward newcomers. He didn't hear the agreement underneath it. He went back to the property and cut the lock. He used a cold chisel and a hammer from the toolbox he brought from Cincinnati, and he worked at it for the better part of an hour because the iron was old and dense and hadn't been designed to give up easily. Catherine stood a few yards back, watching. Edmund and Vera had been sent to play in the front of the house away from the east yard. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray, the trees at the edge of the property already bare. When the lock finally gave, Arthur pulled the door open. The smell that came out was old and closed-in and complex. Wood and earth and something else, something Catherine, having grown up on a farm, recognized without quite being able to name right away. It was the smell of long habitation in a small space, not decay, nothing dead. It was the smell of a place where someone had lived. Arthur stood in the doorway for a moment, then he stepped inside. The cabin was about 12 by 14 feet. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth. The walls were bare logs, the chinking between them dried and cracked in several places. High on the eastern wall, just below the roofline, was the window with its boards still in place. The light that came through the gaps was thin and fell in stripes across the floor. Along the south wall was a plank shelf. On the shelf were objects: a tin cup, badly rusted, a piece of rag that couldn't be identified anymore, a small wooden tool of some kind, hand-carved and worn smooth from handling, and beside the shelf, a series of marks on the wall scratched deep into the wood of the log itself. Marks arranged in groups in a counting pattern, the kind of marks a person makes when they're keeping track of days. Arthur Pettin stood there for a long time looking at those marks. He was a bookkeeper. He counted things for a living. He counted the marks. There were, depending on how you grouped them, somewhere between 480 and 520 days worth of marks on that wall, give or take a week. That was about 16 to 17 months. He came out of the cabin and looked at his wife. She was watching him from the yard, her arms folded against the October chill. She could tell from his face that something was wrong. She asked what was in there. He said it used to be where someone lived. She asked who. He said he didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and started writing down questions. Not answers. He had no answers yet. Just questions in the careful, organized way of a man who has spent his working life making sense of numbers and what they represent. Who had been kept in that cabin, and why, for how long, who authorized it, who maintained it, and who, after everything that had apparently happened there, decided the door should be locked from the outside and never opened again. The questions covered 2 pages. He folded them and put them in his coat pocket. Then he went to bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind moving through the bare trees at the eastern edge of the property, coming from the direction of the cabin whose door now stood open for the first time in 19 years. It wasn't hard for Arthur Pettin to find the county records. He was methodical and patient, and the Rutherford County Courthouse, rebuilt after significant war damage, kept reasonably organized deed and property records going back to the county's founding. What he found over several visits in November and December of 1903 was a paper trail that was revealing in its outlines and frustrating in its gaps. He found the sequence of property sales, each with the clause about the cabin. He found Cornelius Totham's name and his father Elias's and the dates they died. He found the assessment records from before the war, which listed enslaved people on the property by first name only, as was standard. Names recorded not as people but as property values, each followed by an age and an approximate dollar amount. In the 1,840 and 1,845 assessments, among the names was Amos, listed as a male around 30 years old in 1,840, valued at $650. In the 1,850 and 1,855 assessments, Amos appeared again. In the 1,860 assessment, the last one done before emancipation changed everything, Amos was not listed. He had been removed from the inventory before the war. That fit more or less with what the documents suggested about him being moved to the east cabin around 1,800 157. But it raised a new question. What was the official explanation for his absence from the 1,860 inventory? Had he been sold? Had he died? Had someone simply chosen not to include him? Arthur found no record of a sale. He found no death record, though death records for enslaved people in that period were kept inconsistently at best. He found nothing that explained Amos's absence from the 1,860 records except the absence itself. He went back to the cabin. He stood inside and looked at the marks on the wall again. He had brought a candle this time and moved it slowly along the counting marks, examining them more carefully. The groups were regular for most of the wall, but near the end they became irregular. Some were incomplete. Some were made deeper than the others, as if the person making them had pressed harder, or had come back to reinforce a mark already made. And at the very end there was a section where the marks stopped being groups at all, and became something harder to categorize. Not random, but not the counting pattern either. Shapes, angles, something that might, if you looked at it in the right light and let your eyes find what they were looking for, look like attempts at letters. Arthur couldn't read them as letters. He traced them with his finger, trying to find shapes he recognized. He came back 3 times the following week and tried again. He couldn't say for sure what they were. He copied them as carefully as he could into his notebook and carried it home and sat with it for a long time. Catherine watched him doing this. She hadn't been back to the east cabin since the morning they opened it. She had gone in once, briefly, while Arthur was still inside that first day, and she had seen the shelf and the tin cup and the marks on the wall. Then she had come back out into the gray October morning and stood in the yard looking at the tree line for a while. She was an Indiana farm girl, which meant she wasn't easily unsettled by hard history. But she was also the mother of 2 children who were running and playing on land that had, it now seemed, been the site of something she didn't fully understand yet and wasn't sure she wanted to. She asked Arthur one evening what he thought the marks meant. He said he thought they meant someone had been in that cabin without being able to leave for somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years. She asked if he thought it was the man in the assessment records, the one named Amos. He said he thought it was likely. She said, and when he came out, what happened to him? Arthur had no answer for that. He had found no record of Amos after the 1,855 assessment. He had found no record of what the Totems had done about him after emancipation, if he was even still alive by then. He had found no grave record, no Freedmen's Bureau documentation with that name. Nothing in the Nashville records that Gentry's account pointed toward. He said, "I don't know, but I'd like to find out." She said, "I know you would." And then she said something Arthur later wrote down as the sentence that stayed with him longest from that whole time. She said, "I want to know too, but I think we should be ready for the possibility that we're not going to find a good ending to this." Arthur went to Nashville in January of 1904. He spent 4 days in the records offices there, going through Freedmen's Bureau documents, labor records, church records from the African Methodist Episcopal churches in Middle Tennessee, county-level records from surrounding counties. He was looking for an Amos, formerly enslaved from Rutherford County in his 50s or 60s by 1,865 or later, and he didn't find him. What he found instead changed what he thought he was looking for. In the Nashville offices of what had been the Regional Freedmen's Bureau, Arthur came across a collection of claim documents from 1,866 and 1,867. These were records of formerly enslaved people making claims for back wages or property they'd been promised. Most were routine, the desperate bureaucratic records of people trying to get a foothold in a world that had just technically acknowledged their humanity while doing little to actually support it. But buried in a folder of Rutherford County documents was a claim not from Amos himself, but from a woman named Hester Gaines, who identified herself as formerly enslaved on a property in Rutherford County, Tennessee. Her claim was for wages owed by the estate of Cornelius Totem. At the bottom of her claim form, in the space for additional information, she had written, or had someone write for her, A single sentence she apparently felt was relevant to her case. "There is a man who was on that property who was not freed with the others, and I do not know if he is alive. His name is Amos J. Bird. Someone should look for him. Amos J. Bird." Not just Amos, a surname, or rather the kind of name enslaved people sometimes carried as a form of identity that existed outside the records kept by the people who owned them. A name that meant something to Hester Gaines, who had known him. A name that meant he was a person with a history that extended before and beyond his captivity. Arthur Pettin sat in the Nashville Records office with that document in his hands and felt something shift in his understanding of what he had found in that east cabin. He had been thinking of it as a mystery, an old troubling mystery, but a historical one. Something that happened and was resolved one way or another in the distant past. The kind of thing that leaves marks on walls and then is over. But Hester Gaines's notation from 1866 suggested it had not been resolved. That there was someone in 1866, a year after the war ended, still asking about Amos J. Bird, making an official claim in a government bureau's records, hoping someone would look for him. Whether anyone ever did, Arthur couldn't tell. There was no follow-up document in the folder, no resolution. Just Hester's sentence sitting there in the Freedmen's Bureau records for 38 years, unanswered. If you've stayed with us this far into this story, you already understand why nobody wanted to talk to the Pettins about that cabin. Leave a like if this is hitting you the way we think it is, and share this video with someone you feel needs to hear it. Because what Arthur found next in the records he hadn't thought to check yet is the part that changes everything. The key to what happened, the specific human decisions that produced that east cabin and what it contained, came not from the big repositories in Nashville, but from the basement of the Murfreesboro Methodist Church. A deacon named Cyrus Ledbetter had, for reasons he himself couldn't fully explain, kept a collection of letters and personal papers from several local families. He had gathered them after the war during the period of displacement when households were breaking up and their contents were being scattered. He had put them in wooden boxes and kept them in the church basement because he felt, as he told Arthur when Arthur tracked him down in the spring of 1904, that papers about what happened here should stay here, whatever they say. Cyrus Ledbetter was 71 years old. He had been born in Rutherford County and lived there his whole life. He welcomed Arthur into his home, which was small and neat and smelled of pipe smoke and old paper. He listened to what Arthur had found and what he was looking for. Then he got up, went to a cabinet, and came back with a bundle of documents tied with a faded blue ribbon and set them on the table. The documents included several pieces of correspondence involving Cornelius Totham, letters he had written and letters he had received. Ledbetter had gotten them from Dorinda Totham's daughter, who found them among her mother's things after Dorinda died in 1891. Arthur read through them carefully there at Ledbetter's table, with the old man watching him from across the room. The picture that came out was not simple, and it didn't fit the shape Arthur had been expecting. He had been building a narrative with a clear structure. A man locked in a cabin, a cruel and arbitrary act of confinement, a secret kept by a community complicit in its silence. But the letters showed him something more complicated, though not ultimately less damning. Amos J. Bird had, according to a letter Cornelius received in 1856 from a man in Murfreesboro named Thaddeus Creel, been involved in what Creel called communications of a dangerous nature. With the free black population in Nashville, Creel was, as best Arthur could tell from context, some kind of informal go-between for local property owners and the county's law enforcement. The kind of man whose exact role is never officially stated, but everyone understands performs a function in keeping the order of things. The communications Creel referred to, reading between the lines of his careful language, were connected to the broader network of correspondence and mutual help that enslaved and free black people in the South maintained as a form of resistance and survival. Amos J. Bird, it seemed, had been writing or sending word by other means, since literacy was dangerous and often illegal, to people beyond the Totem property. He had been in contact with folks in Nashville. He had, Creel wrote, made himself a problem that requires a solution before it becomes a larger one. Cornelius Totem's response to that letter, a draft of which was in the bundle Ledbetter had saved, was measured and careful. He wrote that he understood the concern, that he would handle the matter privately, that there was no need to involve the county's formal structures, which would create records and attention that served no one's interests. He would take care of it himself. Taking care of it himself meant the east cabin. It meant the thick walls and the high window and the lock on the outside. It meant removing Amos J. Bird from the view of the other enslaved people on the property, from the view of neighbors and travelers and county assessors, and putting him in a state of enforced invisibility, from which Cornelius apparently calculated the problem he represented would simply stop existing. That wasn't an unusual calculation for its time and place. That's part of what makes it so hard to look at directly. It was a form of control that existed within the broad tolerance of a social system that had decided certain things were not crimes and certain people were not victims. Cornelius Totem didn't lock Amos J. Bird in that cabin because he was uniquely cruel. He did it because the system he operated in made it possible, and the community around him made it acceptable, and no one in a position to object had enough power to do so. What happened in that cabin over the 16 to 18 months the counting marks suggest, the documents don't say. Hester Gaines's 1,866 claim suggests Amos was alive when the war ended, or at least that she didn't know he was dead. The disoriented figure in Solomon Gentry's account, the man who walked out of the eastern woods in January 1863 and couldn't make his answers fit the questions, may or may not have been Amos. If it was, then the chaos of the Battle of Stones River, Union troops moving through, Confederate lines broken, the whole social structure of the county momentarily gone, had provided the only opening the locked door couldn't withstand, not force, not rescue, but the temporary collapse of the system that kept it closed. Arthur found one more document in Ledbetter's bundle. It wasn't a letter. It was a half-page of notes in Cornelius Totem's handwriting that appeared to have been written sometime in 1863 after the battle. The notes were fragmentary, not a letter or a journal entry, more like a man working through something on paper. Several lines were crossed out. What remained legible was this: "The cabin is to remain as it is, nothing moved, nothing changed. The door is to stay locked. If anyone asks, the cabin is for storage. If the property is sold, the arrangement is to continue. This is not negotiable. If it ever becomes necessary to explain, though God willing it will not, the explanation is that the situation is settled and the matter is closed. The man is gone. Where he went is not known and should not be inquired after." Arthur sat with that half-page for a long time. The man is gone. Where he went is not known. Cornelius had written those words in 1863, in the weeks after whatever had happened during the battle's chaos, and he had apparently never revised them. He had accepted not knowing as the resolution. He had closed the door and locked it, and passed the instruction along through deeds and social pressure, and the quiet collective agreement of a community that understood without ever having to say it out loud that some questions are better not asked, and he had counted on the architecture of that agreement to hold. It had held for 40 years. It had held through 4 property sales and multiple generations of county residents and a war that was supposed to have changed everything. It had held until a bookkeeper from Cincinnati, with no history in that county and no investment in its silences, showed up with a cold chisel and too many questions. Arthur Pettin went back to his property that evening. He walked out to the east cabin in the April dusk, the trees around the edge just starting to leaf out again. He stood in the doorway and looked at the marks on the wall, 500 or so days' worth of marks made by a man who needed to know that time was passing, that he still existed inside it. He stood there until it was fully dark, and then he went back to the house. Arthur Pettin never published what he found. He wasn't a journalist or a historian. He was a bookkeeper who bought a farm and stumbled into a record of something his country had decided to bury. He wrote up his findings in a careful document, 23 pages, organized the way a bookkeeper organizes things, with sources noted and gaps clearly marked. He sent copies to 3 places: the Freedmen's Bureau Records Office in Nashville, by then essentially a historical archive; the Howard University Library in Washington, which had shown interest in documentation of the post-war period; and a black-owned newspaper in Nashville he had learned about through AM church contacts during his research. He got one response, a brief acknowledgement from the Nashville newspaper thanking him for the documentation and noting it would be added to their collection of records concerning the treatment of formerly enslaved people in Middle Tennessee. Whether anything was ever published, Arthur never confirmed. He never saw any article. He was never contacted again. He and Catherine had a conversation in the late spring of 1904 about whether to stay on the property. Catherine said she had thought about it a lot and didn't think leaving would accomplish anything. Whatever had happened there had happened, and the land was the land, and running from it didn't feel like the right response. Arthur agreed, though he noted he had lost a lot of his enthusiasm for farming in general, and the property's main appeal, its price, its mystery, had resolved itself in a way he hadn't expected. They stayed for 6 more years. Arthur never fully made peace with the property's history the way Catherine seemed to. He walked past the East Cabin every day. And what he felt, he wrote in a letter to his brother in 1907, was not fear or anything supernatural or irrational, but a kind of grief he couldn't quite place. Not for someone he had known, but for the fact of it, for the normalcy of it. For the 40 years of silence that had required no conspiracy, no dramatic enforcement, just the quiet agreement of people who decided their comfort was worth more than someone else's existence. He wrote, "The worst thing I found in that cabin was not the marks. The worst thing was how easy it was. Nobody had to force anyone to keep quiet. They just did, generation after generation, because keeping quiet was easier than not keeping quiet. I think about that a great deal." The property was sold in 1910. The deed did not contain the clause about the East Cabin. Arthur removed it. He also took the boards off the window before they left so that light could come through. He wasn't sure why that felt important. It just did. What became of Amos J. Bird is not known. The historical record, for all of Arthur Pettin's searching, never answered that question. There is no death record. There is no Freedmen's Bureau record. There is Hester Gaines's 1866 notation. Someone should look for him. And then silence. It is possible he survived. It is possible he built a life somewhere outside the reach of Rutherford County's records. It is possible he lived for decades after walking out of that cabin, if it was him who walked out and found his way to people who could help him, and his story continued in directions that left no paper trail for a Cincinnati bookkeeper to follow 30 years later. It is also possible it went the other way. The documents don't say. What the documents do say, clearly, if you're willing to read them, is that a community of ordinary people, none of them monsters in any dramatic sense, kept a silence for 40 years that made one man's suffering nobody's problem and nobody's business. They kept it through property transactions and social pressure and the simple, devastating power of collective agreement. And when the silence was finally broken, it was broken by an outsider, someone who hadn't been taught to look away, using nothing more dramatic than a cold chisel and the belief that questions deserve answers. The East Cabin stood on the property until at least 1923, when county records show it was torn down. The main house was renovated several times over the following decades. The land is still farmland today, and people drive past it without knowing its name. But the marks are gone now. They were in a cabin that no longer exists. The only record of them is in Arthur Pettin's 23-page document, which sits in the Howard University Library catalogued under Property Records and Personal Accounts, Middle Tennessee, 1910, where it has been for over a century, waiting as records do for someone to look. This mystery from the Fear Sermon shows us something that history keeps coming back to. That cruelty does not require monsters. It requires ordinary people making ordinary decisions about what to see and what to look away from, agreeing without ever quite saying it aloud that some doors are better left closed. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there parts of this that no record could ever fully capture? Drop your comment below. If this story stayed with you the way we hope it did, subscribe to the Fear Sermon, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear stories that history tried to forget. We'll see you in the next one.